Alfred. Here we go. Yeah, so Christoph says the network quality isn't good. What do we think, everybody? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Okay, good deal. So I just put those two documents in the Zoom chat. So our requirements for Sprint 4. So let's go over these together before we dive into classes for the day. So the project that you're going to be working on is a human resources automation project. So this one's pretty cool. I like this one. So if you've ever worked in the United States, you have probably seen and filled out the I-9 form. It's a pain if you're a citizen. It's especially a pain if you're not. But this is the document that US companies are required to keep on file for every employee to verify eligibility to work in the United States. So that's what we're going to be working on, is a process that automates the way that HR departments can fill out this form. So it's a big deal. You know, back when I worked in hotel management, I actually knew some colleagues who actually did some jail time for not doing this document correctly. It's something that's very serious that employers have to take seriously, because you will get into big trouble if you don't do it properly. And so that's something I want everybody to keep in mind while you're going through your process, that this is, it's not a matter of, oh, well, we lost the purchase request. That this is something with serious legal ramifications. And so our process needs to work functionally to make sure that our employer, our customer, your client does not end up in hot water. Let me get the chat over here. So human resources is looking to automate their manual process for creating employment eligibility verification documents, also known as the Form I-9. The goal of this process is to upload a CSV document that will then automatically generate the I-9 document. So we're going to upload a list of people with detailed information about those people, and that will automatically generate I-9 documents with all of the fields already filled out for that person. The purpose of this project is to eliminate manual user error and to allow electronic signature, have one central location to view, download, and print these documents. So the scope and objective of this project is to have the ability to have the HR representative upload a new CSV file, convert data to an I-9 PDF, store documents within the decisions environment, and allow users to sign, view, and download the completed documents. Deliverables of design and development are the ability to upload the CSV, to import the data, to clean the data and convert it to an I-9 format. So data is going to be coming through with different formats for serial social security numbers and phone numbers. And we're going to, just like we did with the USPS project, clean that up, do some text cleanup to it so that it's all in the same format. The ability to store the documents into a folder, and then the ability to sign, view, and download the completed documents. So we have our process model down below, and this one, I actually like this one a lot more because it's the swim lanes document. It's a lot less easy to confuse this for the way that your flow should look. This one, so if we haven't seen a swim lanes document before, and I don't know if you have, this is still a process model. It's a process map, but instead of showing us the flow chart of how the logic should move through, it gives us a little bit more of context for which users, which part of the process are we working with, who is the individual, who are the groups who are going to interact with that process. So at the top line, we have the human resources, and anything that appears in this swim lane is completed or done by the human resources department. We have the system. So this is stuff that decisions is handling automatically. These are our rules, our logic that we build into the process to handle that automation. So that's interesting, Daria. Apologies for that. However, they are in the Zoom chat. So we do have those documents there. And at our next break, At our next break, I'll make sure that those are uploaded in the LMS. Here we go. And then the employee themselves, they get two parts of this process. They can sign their I-9 and they can view the completed I-9 form. Here we go. And a reminder there, the process model shows general functionality. It gives us an idea of the logic. This is not representative of the way your flow should look. So the feature overview. We want to generate those PDF documents. So we're going to import a CSV file. We're going to filter selected rows. So part of that process is that our user is going to be able to select which rows out of that CSV they actually want to generate an I-9 for. So for whatever reason, the client has said that they want to be able to upload that big master list and then only select certain people. We want to save those details to the database, convert the data to PDF, and store that PDF, and then view those PDF documents. So the assumptions are that the user will upload a CSV file to generate the PDF document. So we don't need to worry about file formatting. We don't need to do the auto select. We don't need to worry about Excel. These are always going to be CSVs. Generating the I-9 PDF documents will consist of an HR representative uploading an I-9 CSV file, selecting which rows to upload, cleaning the data, and converting it to a PDF. So these generated documents will be stored within the decisions environment to be viewed. So process outline, we're gonna go straight past that. That's a lot of details that we will get to later. We are going to have a dashboard, form mockups. Here we go. So this is our employee dashboard. They should just be able to see their documents here. And then the HR dashboard will be able to see all of their documents in the dashboard. We're going to have two data structures. So one is a flow structure. So somebody remind me from a high level, what does a flow structure do for us in decisions? What are the primary reasons I would use that versus a different data structure? Apologies, everybody. I'm a little bit hoarse this morning. Exist only in the flow, not persistent. Very good. So this is a way for us to handle our data, but without committing it to the database. So we're also going to have this folder extension data structure, and this is the one that we're going to use to save this information to the database. This is the way we're going to store our I-9 documents. And it's a much smaller data structure. It's just got the application number, email, and the application date. Groups and roles, login, error handling, testing and approval. Good deal. Let's see the requirements in the Zoom chat. Oh, apologies, y'all. Let me fix that. Here we go. There we go. We should have access to those now. Good deal. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start talking about advanced form controls. Here we go. So advanced form control. So our objectives today, I'm going to tell you about data repeaters. This is going to be the main crux of our lesson this morning. I'm going to tell you about SubDialogs. We're not going to go heavily into that because you're not going to use it this week. This is something that you're going to do with next week's project. So we're going to go kind of light on the SubDialogs. And CSS, I'm going to tell you about CSS, but we're not going to go heavy into it. So the big crux for today, the one that you're going to use this week, is data repeaters. And everything else is kind of informational. So starting us off, a data repeater is a component that we can add to a decisions form that allows us to show multiple rows without having to build out each individual row. So this is a way for us to automate the information that appears for us on the screen. It can show us all of the records that we need to see for a particular thing, either as editable fields or not. It gives us the ability to add and remove multiple sets of data, multiple objects from a particular data structure here in a form. So the part of this form that we're viewing that is the data repeater is the block with many lines, this data rows section down here in the middle. So typically when you're doing a data repeater, well, you always have to have a complex type that it's running through. It either needs to be a custom data structure that you've created or one that already exists in the system, like accounts. So a data repeater requires that complex type in order to be able to go through each of those elements so that when you pass it in a list of that complex type, it can then display the exposed properties that you need here in the data repeater. So we're going to dive straight in. We're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm not going to use an abstract example for this. We're going to build the one that you're actually using this week, because I think that that's going to be easier than anything I could show you and hopefully remove some confusion. So the data repeater that I'm about to build is the actual one that you're going to use in your project this week. So let's jump into decisions. And I actually started doing this over the weekend. Just going to delete that. So I'm going to create my project folder that I'm going to use for Sprint 4. For myself, I'm going to call this Sprint 4 I9 generation. As always, if you're using a training instance, please do rename or name all of your elements to contain your initials. There we go. And then I'm going to create my folder scaffolding as always. I'm going to go kind of light with it. I'm just going to make myself a data structures, a flows, and a forms, because that's all we're going to be doing for right now. Here we go. So the first thing that I need to do to get a data repeater is I'm going to need my data structures. So I am going to go ahead and create from the requirements document. Sorry, everybody, bear with me just a moment. Okay, apologies, everybody. Okay, so the first thing I need is my data structure. So I'm going to go to my Sprint 4 PDF mapping requirements. And the one that we need is the I9 import data. So this is the data structure that's going to facilitate the uploading of the CSV and handle our data as it moves through the flow. So I'm going to create this data structure back over here in decisions. From my designer folder actions at the top, I'm going to create data types, and I'm going to choose a flow structure. As always, give it my initials, call it VWI9, import data. And then because this is kind of a big data structure, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the quick add feature in the data definition screen to add all of these members quickly. And this is going to be especially useful because most of the data members that we're creating are strings. So I'm only going to have to go back and edit a couple of them. So here in the quick add menu, it's already selected to string. I'm going to go through and create all of those data members. So last name, first name, okay. Whew, Monday morning, here we go. Apartment number, city, state. And if you're not following along, if you'd rather just watch, that's totally fine. But like I said, we are actually completing portions of your project. So we will potentially be able to save you some time, some heartache, answer any questions as we go with some of the more difficult or challenging portions of this project. Okay, so once I hit OK in the quick add, it's going to generate all of those data types. And I'm just going to make a couple of changes here. So most of these are strings. I'm going to change date of birth to be a date time, and also expiration date. And then I'm going to deviate just a teensy bit from the requirements. And I'm going to make import a Boolean. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. You don't have to follow along with this. It's for a purely aesthetic reason that I'm going to do this. But I'm going to make this a Boolean. Well, potentially a purely aesthetic reason. I think it actually makes things a little bit easier in the long run. But I'm going to make that a Boolean. So this is going to be the piece of data that is used in our data repeater to determine whether or not a particular row from the CSV should be imported. So the way that this is designed to work is by using string matching, but I just don't like using string matching. And there's a really cool form control that we can use for this that we can only use with a Boolean. So I'm going to make that a Boolean. It's a yes or no value. That should be fine. Here we go. So now, refresh. I should have my data structure. Good. So there's my I9 import data. This is the first component I need in order to create my data repeater, because it has to have a complex type or a data structure that it can run through and list or add or remove things from. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go back to my requirements document. And in order to get our process working properly, we are going to go ahead and create 2 forms. So we could do this with input data on a flow or with the debugger, just paste in a file. However, creating the document upload, this is one that y'all have done before in previous sprints. It doesn't take more than a couple of minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and create my file import form too. Here we go. So from my designer folder actions at the top of my forms folder, the create form and call this my import form. And then just very quickly, I'm going to modify this structure so that it's a single column and 1 resizable row on this grid layout. Adjust the size so that it has the general layout that I want. And then I'm going to add that file upload area. So just like that, my form matches the mockup. I'm going to add my 2 buttons. So I'm going to have my submit, or is it import? Import. And cancel. So we should be so far kind of retreading some things that y'all already know pretty well. But if I'm going too fast, if you have questions, please let me know. I'm going to call my data that is generated by the file import area imported file. And this form is done. So this is how my users are going to upload that CSV file. Now we're going to give them a way to do something with that file. So we're going to create the form that's going to use our data repeater, which is the selected I9 data form. So here's what the mockup looks like. So it should be kind of an oblong or rectangular rather form, longer on the horizontal side that contains these 3 fields, first name, last name, and email. And there's a little note down here that these should be labels, not text boxes. No one's going to be editing this information. We're just displaying it for our users. And then over here on the right, we have this import field. And the mockup does display it as a dropdown. But the reason that I made this a Boolean is so that I can show you a slightly different form control that we don't use very often, but I think is pretty cool. So we're going to have those 3 fields and then the import yes or no function. So we're going to make that form. So back in my forms folder, in my designer folder actions at the top, I'm going to create a form. And this is going to be my CSV import form. And then I'm going to give it the general shape of the one in the mockup. So it's going to be longer on the horizontal side. I'm going to adjust this grid layout in here so that it's actually the same as the file upload that we just did. It's not going to have anything on it except for this one by one large area. So our data repeater is going to go in here. And it's going to fill all of this space that it can with all of that data that we're going to be adding and removing from it using the data repeater function. So I'm going to go ahead and add my buttons. This is going to be my import and cancel. And then I'm going to add the data repeater control to my form. So this is a component that we can find in the toolbox in the forms designer. I'm going to find it by just searching data repeat. And you can see that there are 3 components that we can add here. So first is the data repeater. This is what we're actually going to be using. So I'm just going to let that fill up the entire body of my form that I'm creating. We also have these data repeater add and remove buttons. So these are buttons that we would use if we were doing, say, maybe it's a purchase request, to bring it back to an old example that we know. So I'm adding items to a list that I want someone to buy for me. So I know that I need a laptop. So I will hit the data repeater add button where it says add data, add a new row to the list, fill in the details that I want. And then I also need a lamp. So I hit add data, it adds a new row. I continue on with my list. We also have the data repeater remove data button that we would use to select a particular row and remove that. Now that's not something that we're going to be doing with this project. This project does not allow our users to add or remove data. They're not going to be doing that from here. The only thing that this data repeater does is it displays for us the information imported from our CSV file. So here in my data repeater control, you can see here that it says pick source. So this is pretty familiar to us. It wants us to pick or create a data repeater that already exists or create one to fill this space. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And then in the properties over on the right with my data repeater selected, I'm going to hit pick or create, and I'm going to create new. It gives me one option here in the picker. It's the repeater control. So this is the component that allows you to repeat rows of data within a form. I'm going to select that. I'm going to call this my I9 import repeater control. Here we go. And so once I do that, you can see that we're back in the Forms Designer. I've got my big gray canvas here. I have a very simple grid structure, and it looks like a row. So the data repeater knows what it's for, and it knows that it should be something that appears as rows in a greater list of items. So we're going to assemble what our data repeater row is going to look like in here. So I know from the mockup, it needs to be these three fields: first name, last name, and email. And then I need my import yes or no function. So when we look at our data repeater, there's no buttons or anything in here. There's no headers. It's just the row. So whatever we create here is going to fill up that empty space in our main form with the data that is the body of the form itself. So I have 3 fields currently. I need to add one more. So I'm going to click into this grid structure, and I'm going to create the space that's going to hold my import toggle over here on the right. So in the grid layout, I'm going to add an additional column, and I want to make it a little bit smaller than the rest. I'll call it 0.3. That's a little too small. Oh, because it's fixed. Let's try 0.3 resizable. Much better. Okay. Still a little small. I can still do more than that. 0.6. Okay. So now I have my 3 fields. So first name, last name, email, and those are meant to be labels. So before I do that, I've got the layout that I want. And I know that I want labels to appear here that are going to display data that comes from my data structure. So like I said, a data repeater requires that there is a data structure attached to it. It needs to know what kind of data it's displaying. So I'm going to move my mouse away from my grid structure, click out here into the empty canvas area so that there's no orange dotted lines. I don't have anything selected at the moment. And then in the properties for the data repeater control itself, I'm going to find the form data section. So this is where I tell my data repeater what kind of information it should be working with. So I'm going to pick, and out of the list, I'm going to find my I9 import data. Oh, that's the wrong one. My I9 import data structure. So I'm telling this data repeater that this is the info that it should have. So now that it knows, I can add my labels into the form. And just like we've done before, I'm going to say text from data name pick from data, and you can see I already have my form data section here. So this is stuff that this data repeater knows that it should have access to. And the components of that are all of the data members of my I9 import data structure. So from here, I just need to select the appropriate fields. So I'm going to go with first name. Yep. Do another one here. It's going to be last name. So in form data, it already knows that it should have all of my import data, and email. So text from data name, pick from data, and select email. So those are our three labels. It's going to display these three pieces of information for everybody that gets uploaded through our CSV. Now I need the import function over on the right. So the way that this is written is that it wants you to use a string value and then have a drop-down list. But I'm going to show you something cool. So there's a form component in here that we can choose from, and it is the toggle button. So the toggle button requires a Boolean. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that onto my data repeater control, pick from data, and I'm going to map it to my import value. I'm going to change the text on the data on the toggle so that it matches the mockup, however. So I'm going to say that true is yes and false is no. Is this going okay for everybody so far? Good deal. Excellent. So I'm going to do a little bit of reformatting here. I'm just going to move some things around so that they fit a little bit better. I'm going to edit that grid structure. So this is something that I don't know if we've shown y'all before, but now that I have all of my fields are occupied here in my grid structure, I can't select the structure itself, or at least it's difficult to. So I want to select not just the data repeater control, its outer grid, or any of the individual elements here in my grid layout. I want to get to that grid layout itself so that I can adjust the width of this portion of my data repeater control. So I'm going to go over to the Explorer, and in there, I can see all of my layers that I have. So we have the surface container, we have the root container, label. Oh, it's not going to let me, really? Oh, because it's right here. So good deal. So if I select that root container, which I guess is the one that I had selected earlier, sorry, it's not as good an example as I thought it was going to be. But from here, I can adjust that size. We'll take that down to 0.4. Okay. Yeah, I can live with that. I think that's pretty good. Here we go. And so that's our repeater control. This is going to repeat for every element that gets passed in through that CSV and display all of these things in line in our main import form. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And when I close, I can now see that that appears here in the body of my data repeater. It doesn't look the way that I've formatted it. If I save and come back in, it should look a little bit closer. Yeah, there we go. So now it looks like our form. So in here, I do need to call this, I believe I'm going to call this imported rows, is going to be the data name, the output of this form control when it gets passed out when our user hits import. You can see down here in the properties, because Decisions knows that I've selected a data repeater element, it's giving me the ability to say, hey, do you want an add and remove button for this data repeater? We know that we're not going to use one, but if you ever wanted to, you can use any button you want. It doesn't have to be the repeater control buttons, or you can change the names of them. But then you just want to map them to these add and remove buttons so that Decisions can know Okay, when that button gets pressed, I need to add a row to this data repeater or remove the selected row. Cool. So I'm going to save that. And now we need places to put those things. I want to test this out. I want to see how it works. So I'm going to create a flow. So in my flows designer folder, I'm going to create a flow for my designer folder actions up at the top. I'm going to call this my import flow. What is it supposed to be called? Main process flow. We'll go with that. Here we go. So for this flow, starting out, I'm going to have it do three things. I'm going to have it import. So I'm going to add a show form step. Add my CSV import form that we just created. Here we go. And I'm going to add another show form step over here. And this one's going to be my import data form. So now I have these two forms. The CSV tool that you used to get the other report to show up. So I haven't actually done anything with CSVs yet. Can you tell me a little bit more about your question, Chris? Let's take a look. So I'm going to map this in. So it already has. So do you mean this element here? Okay. So this is the data repeater element. So it's the data repeater in the steps toolbox. So I am going over this for everybody. I do welcome questions, but you know, we will want to keep moving ahead. So remember that this is being recorded. You can always go back and watch again, but this is the data repeater control. Here we go. So now I have my two forms on the canvas. I have my import form and my not renamed import data form. So I need to take in a CSV file here and then somehow display its information over here on the right. Now, this is something that we've been over before. This is something that we should be kind of familiar with. There are many options, many answers to this question. What are some steps that I can use to take that information from the CSV and then display it here on my form? How can I do that? Go ahead and search in the steps toolbox. Find me some steps. There are several potential answers to this question. And everybody cross your fingers and hope that your trainer remembers which steps she's going to use to do this. Map CSV, okay. So let's see, map CSV. We have several options here. So I'm actually just going to search. No, this is fine. So I have CSV to database mapping, list mapping, object mapping, import Excel CSV, list to CSV mapping. We can go the other way. CSV to object, that is the one that I'm going to use. I'm pretty sure you can actually use you might be able to use the database mapping. You might be able to use the list mapping, but what we are going to use is the CSV to object mapping. Great guess, both Ala and Christoph. So this one is going to allow us to take that CSV data and put it into our import data flow structure so that our data repeater can access it. So just to keep my flow clean, I'm going to go ahead and connect my cancel line to my end step. I might end up doing something different with that later, but I don't want to worry about it. Here we go. I'm going to make sure that this is all good. I'm going to connect my import to my CSV to object mapping and my CSV to object mapping to my import data form. Here we go. So I have my CSV to object mapping. It wants a file data input, which is very handy because that is the output of my imported file data type that's being spit out by my import form. So perfect. I'm going to go ahead and map those things together. So I have my variable here, imported file. So I'm going to pick, and out of my available properties, choose imported file. So validation errors are gone. Am I done? Is that all I need to do with this step? Is decision smart enough to handle everything else on its own? You all may have used this one before. I know in your previous projects when you were working with CSVs, there really were options. You could do different things with this if you wanted to. But what's my next step? Am I ready to move on to my data repeater? Define output type. Okay. Yeah, so I have this output type down here. And you're absolutely right. Now, I could go through and find user-defined types. I'm going to go through the search. I'm going to find my import. Yep, this one, VWI9 import data, and choose that so that my CSV to object mapping step knows that whatever it takes in, it needs to leave as my import data structure. Excellent job, Christoph. And so now it knows what data structure it should be doing. I still don't have any validation errors. Is that all I need to do? Change it to CSV intake? Absolutely, great job. Because remember, one of our assumptions for the project is that we're not going to have auto select. It's always going to be a CSV. Mappings. Show item mapping. Great job, everybody. I love it. So up here at the top of our properties, we're going to do the show item mapping. So over here, I have my item, which is import data. This is our complex data type, our custom data structure. And right now it's unknown. I'm going to change that to build data so that I can expose its properties. And then over here on the left, out of my available properties, I have this file data. I know that the file I'm passing through is file data, but I don't see any of my properties. Where should I go to find those actual fields so that I can map them in to my data structure members? Input, great job. Here we go. So here I have field 1, field 2, field 3, because of course decisions doesn't know, it's not reading those headers on the CSV. I haven't given it a CSV yet. It just knows, hey, like CSVs have columns. So which one should it be? And so each of these, field 1, field 2, these are columns. So for each row, it's going to create our data member and our data structure. And so I'm looking at the value for column 1, the value for column 2. So I'm going to match that up with the CSV file that we have here in mapping table. Here in the requirements document, we should have our sample CSV. Here we go. So link to I9 CSV file. I'm going to download this. I'm going to put it into our Zoom chat. And again, at a break, I'm going to make sure that this is all in the LMS. So here's the actual CSV that we're using. So column 1, field 1 is going to be first name. Column 2 or field 2 is last name and continuing on. So I'm just going to put this over on my second monitor so that I can go through these. So field 1 is last name. So I'm going to map that to the last name over here on the right-hand side. Doing something like this is one of the few times when I'll actually use the graphical property or input mapping. Because we're using a lot of values, it's kind of complex. The things on the left don't make any sense. So for me, this is when the graphical editor actually like it earns its keep. This is when it actually becomes useful for me. I usually just use the properties bar in the flow editor. So field 2 is first name. So I'm going to drag that up to first name. We have other last name is field 3. Field 4 is middle initial. I'm going to slow down. I'm going to give everybody a moment to get that file downloaded and get back to the same spot in case you are following along. I realize that it probably will take a moment to get yourself situated, so we'll just give everybody a minute. There we go. So field 5 is address. Field 6 is apartment number. City. State. Zip. And so this one gets funky. So field 10 is date of birth. So if I try to take field 10 and pass it into date of birth, I get a validation error. Selected path is not valid. What should I do? Is the correct answer panic? Choose the date format, explicit mapping. I like it. Ooh, I like that terminology. So I'm going to open up the properties of field 10 to expose its sub-properties. And in here, I do have a date value. So this is a date time. And so I can use that to map into date of birth and clear that validation area. Excellent job, everybody. Collapse that again so that it doesn't confuse me. Next up is SSN. Email. Phone. Citizenship. USCIS number. Okay. I-94 admission number. Foreign passport. Entry of issuance. And finally, one more date. Expiration date. Here we go. All right, and that's our mapping for our CSV to object mapping step. I'm going to pause for just a moment to give everybody who's following along a chance to catch up. I'm just going to save this because I'm paranoid, and I'll open it back up for everybody. Here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. So that takes care of our first two steps in our flow. We're going to upload our file. We're going to upload our file in our CSV intake form. It's going to do the CSV to object mapping so that it gets converted into I9 import data, our flow structure. And then I want my data repeater to show that information. So it wants imported rows. That's the name of the variable that I gave to our data repeater. and it wants a list of VWI9 import data, which just happens to be the output of my CSV to object mapping step. So it's a list of VWI9 import data. So I can just find this outputs variable that I should have renamed here and map that in. For the selected line number, this is a control or an element or a feature, for want of more specific terminology, for the data repeater itself. This is a way that I could say, hey, this is the row that should be selected or highlighted. That's one of the features of a data repeater, is that I can click on a row, and using CSS, I can see either like a blue check mark or something to indicate that this is the row that I have selected and that I'm working with. I'm going to go ahead and ignore that because that's not a feature that we're going to be using for our data repeater. Just like I did with the import form, I'm going to drag my cancel down to my end step. And actually, I think that I can go ahead and just connect that there as well, just for the purposes of testing. And now I'm going to do a debug. I'm going to see how this process works. Is it displaying that information the way I expect it to? Have I done everything right? I hope so. So I'm going to do a debug. It shows me my import form. I'm going to drag my CSV file that I shared with you all previously into that file upload area and click import. It does the CSV to object mapping. And then here is, so I do see there is a problem already. I have first name, last name, and email as rows in my data repeater. What have I done wrong? I talked about this and I forgot. But otherwise, this is working, right? I can see my yes or no. But why am I getting this row first name? Skip the first row. Absolutely. Great job, Ala. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. I'm going to fix that problem. Go back to my import data form. No, it's in the CSV to object mapping. And in the input data where I selected that this is a CSV, I'm going to ignore first line so that it doesn't give me row 1, which contains my headers. And do that one more time. Drag in my CSV. And now here is my data repeater with only my first name, last name, email, and the ability to say yes or no on any individual lines. That's data repeaters, everybody. What are some uses you can think of for a data repeater? While everybody's doing some debugging and formulating questions, what are some ways you can think of that you might use this in practice? Does anybody need more time? Do we have questions? Is this all pretty straightforward? So repeat which. So really, I'm just asking for questions if anybody needs assistance with anything. Cool. All right. So as promised, we are going to loop back to the slides for just a few minutes. We're going to talk about some of those other controls that I mentioned. So next up is SubDialogs. So this is something that we're not going to be using this week. Selective import of contacts. Yeah, absolutely, Shashidar. So selective import of contacts. Like I said, the purchase request system, that's actually kind of the way that you're going to be using it next week is, okay, well, I have a new hire and what equipment do they need? So I'm going to add rows for each of those elements. Absolutely. So a subdialog is similar to a data flow in a form. And remember, this is an advanced form control, but it allows a pop-up within a parent form. So I can already have one form up displayed in my session, filling it out. And then when I click a button or interact with a certain element, I can have another window appear in front of that to either be something that I can interact with and send data back to the parent form, or maybe it's just a message that gets displayed to me. Like maybe I need a pop-up that says, we don't want to just do like the basic validation errors that we're used to. I actually want to like zoom out and show something to my user that's more specific. So this is a way that we can show a form within a form. Would be the purpose of SubDialogs. So again, this isn't something that you're going to use this week. This is something that we're going to talk about next week, because that's when it's going to become relevant to your project. And then using CSS on forms. So up to this point, we've probably just used, and in training, that's all we're gonna use, is the default editing tools that we get out of the form designer. So with that, we can do things like change the color and shape of our buttons to a degree. We can change the color and shape of text manually on each individual label, or on each individual component. I can go in and say ignore form font and then make it whatever I want. But if I wanted to do that programmatically and I wanted to have a consistent style across my decisions elements, I can use CSS for that. We do have some built-in files in decisions. This is something that's changed a little bit in version 7. There used to be a just pure play with me kind of CSS file that was available in here. But we're going to take a look in the system designers and CSS. And in here, we can find some CSS files that already exist. So if we go into any of these, clean styles, clean tile style, we can click on any one of these files. And this is one that I've created in the past. This is based on the old default file that was available for us to edit. So it was called Agile Co. And it wasn't comprehensive, as this big block of README is telling us is, yeah, hey, this doesn't account for everything, but it's a good place to start. This gives you the ability to go in and find certain elements. Like, let's say I want to find a button. And so here is my button border radius. So I can change the rounding of the corners here by altering this value on the other side of this colon. I can find the button height. I have some different properties. And here we go, a great big button section where I can go in and change the view and the layout of my buttons. Now, if you don't know anything about CSS, I don't blame you. I don't particularly like working with CSS. It's not my favorite thing in the world. However, if I just want to change one or two things, especially colors, this can be especially useful. So like up here at the top of this file, there's just this colors section where I would use a tool like, no, it's coolers. Yeah, so a tool like this one to just generate a palette and say, okay, stop it. I want you to generate me a palette that works together. And I don't particularly like this one. So I'm gonna cycle through. Here we go. So something like this, a palette of colors that work together. Grab these color codes and then just stick them into that colors section so that all of my decisions elements have a similar style to one another. Now, again, this isn't something that you're using this week. This is really just informational ways that you can use CSS and how to use CSS within your elements. So once you've modified your file, or you have a developer or someone who knows CSS help you modify a file, and we upload it, we can then go back into our decisions elements, like let's say my form. I'm gonna go into, not this one, go into my CSV import form, modify my data repeater, and I have these 3 labels in here. Whoa. I have these 3 labels in here. And let's say I want them to appear with a different font, but I don't want to go in and have to manually modify each one. and say that uncheck the use form font and do something different, I can just choose a CSS class that exists, potentially, maybe. It should be there. So apparently my CSS file is broken. Apologies, everybody. But once we have a class that actually exists, you can select it here, and then that element will just change and take on the properties that you've defined in your CSS file. Mine is apparently not working, and I will have to find out why. But it's a way for us to avoid saying the use form font, and instead just select a class so that all of your elements match, are using your color scheme, are fitting with the style guide for your organization. So as I said, CSS SubDialogs, those are just informational. SubDialogs you're going to use next week, so we'll give more time to that then. But CSS is just purely information. So the big crux of this first lesson was data repeaters. So we're going to take a break here in just a moment. But before we do, any questions? Hey, welcome, Kieran. Yeah, go for it. What's up? Yeah, I know. I'm sorry about that. That is not your fault, of course. So we talked about data repeaters. So I know you joined late. This is being recorded. I'll get you that recording. But so far, we've talked about data repeaters. So this is hopefully, throughout the rest of the day, you'll be able to keep up. However, you'll need to go back and watch that first hour or so that you missed this morning. All right. Good deal. So let's go ahead and take a short break. We'll come back in 15 minutes. Oh, we're going to do the fall leaves. So we're going to come back in 15 minutes and pick up where we left off. See you all in just a few. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope we had an excellent break. All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope we had an excellent break. Can you hear me? Am I coming through okay? Excellent, thank you. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about configuration folders. So this is something that we've probably mentioned in the past, but probably haven't gone into a lot of detail on. Configuration folders do something that's kind of important for us. Can anybody give me kind of the high level definition? What do we do with a configuration folder? And if nobody can, that's fine, because again, I think we've mentioned it, but it's not something that we've gone into a lot of detail over. Cool, no worries. So we're gonna skip that slide. What is a configuration folder? Oh, excuse me. What is a configuration folder? So this is a designer folder that extends the capabilities of a decisions data structure. So Ala answered, gives the ability to add actions to the data structure. That's exactly right. So the key function of this is that it gives us the ability to add those actions, like Ala said. And typically we refer to these as CRUD actions. So my developer people in the room, people with a software background, what do I mean by CRUD? What does that mean? C-R-U-D. Create, delete, update. That's exactly right. So that CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. So think about those words. So when we're talking about entities in a data structure, we can create an entity, we can read an entity, so gather information about it, update it, so modify its properties, or delete it, removing it from the data structure altogether. So that CRUD is create, read, update, delete, gives us the ability to interact with our decisions entities using configuration folder actions. So what do those look like? So the typical way that we interact with these actions is by right-clicking on an element in a list of entities in decisions. So if we're looking at a list of our elements, we can right click on those and get some actions that we can use to perform those CRUD actions. So create, read, update, delete. So I can right click on an entity and then use those actions that I've designed in my configuration folder to interact with that entity. We can also add action visibility rules, which is something that you're going to do this week, so that you can choose when those actions appear. One of the features of our project is that the action to sign should only be available if it hasn't been signed. I'm going to try to find the actual line. Oh, well, I'm not going to waste any time with it. One of the key elements of your project this week is that you're going to add an action visibility rule so that your action only appears if certain conditions are met. Like you can only get the sign action if the form hasn't been signed, for instance. Here we go. So where to find these? So when you create a data structure that has the capability inherently of adding configuration folder actions, it's going to create that configuration folder inside your data structures folder, wherever you create that data structure. So we can see here that we have our release notes doc360 HTML project. That's a data structure. And then created along with it is the entity configuration. We've got the data structures matrix over here on the right to let us know which data structures have the ability to add those CRUD actions via a configuration folder. So we can see here that's line 4 in our data structures matrix. Configuration folder lives in the portal. Entities, external entities, case entities, these all get them by default. There is this little blurb here in database structures that lets us know that they're not created by default, but we can activate them. So you can choose to have a configuration folder for a database structure if you so wish to. And
That's exactly the demonstration that I'm going to show you in just a moment. So data structures with configuration folders. Yep, good. So how to use these. So from within the configuration folder, there's this user actions up here at the top that you can use to create those actions. It's going to give you a flow. You're going to create that flow that will allow you to perform whatever action it is. So this doesn't have to be as basic as update this or create this or delete this. It can be, but it can also be as complex as you need it to be, because you get all of the functionality of the flow designer to create those actions to be as specific as you need them to be. And then once you've done that, once you right click your entities, you're going to have those actions available to you. So without further ado, let's see how this works. So this is the software inventory project that I demoed, I believe, for this class. This is something that we've seen before, right? This is how I showed y'all parent-child reporting. Does this seem familiar? I think it was this class. At any rate, excellent, good. So what I've got here is my software inventory system. This is extremely basic. It consists of 3 data structures. They're all database structures. So we have our simple data structures, manufacturer, software, and version. So looking at that data structures matrix, these simple data structures do not get configuration folders by default. I would have to activate them in order to get those user actions. So this is something that you don't have to do with a case entity or with a flow execution extension. It's just going to create those all on its own, which is something that you should have seen before. But because this is a database structure, I'm going to have to activate them. So I'm going to right click here and edit my defined data structure. Go under advanced. Which one is it? Is it configure custom attributes? No, there's like an actions, right? Look up audit changes. So when in doubt, and it's apparently been too long since I've done this, I thought, no, I'll remember what I'm doing once I'm looking at it. Apparently not. We're going to go to the documentation. I'm going to look up configuration folders. It's going to be in here somewhere. Apologies, everybody. Base type. Oh, gosh, it's right in front of me. I was literally looking right at it. So it's actions down here below. Sorry, everybody. Coffee hasn't quite kicked in yet. So it's actually the one down here at the bottom. So in the actions section, and so you'll notice that I had to, if I click into any of my rows, I'm not going to see that actions. I do have to be in, like clicking into the field where I can change the name of the database structure is the way that I'll get to the properties for the structure itself. And then down at the bottom of the list, we have this action section with one checkbox in it, enable actions, and I'm going to select that. Pretty sure I don't need to fill these in, so I'm going to leave them blank. As we've just demonstrated, it has been a minute since I've actually done this. Normally, whenever I'm doing CRUD actions or configuration folder actions, I'm using a database structure or a data structure that already has them enabled. So it's not typically something I'll do with the database structure. But I'm going to do the enable actions and save. And once I do that, my folder should update. Yep. And now I have this entity configuration section that wasn't here before. And within that, I have my manufacturer's configuration. So in the example that we did previously, several weeks ago, I created all of these flows to create my individual elements. What I'm going to do is I'm going to enable it so that whenever I right click on an entity in my list, in my dashboard, I'll have the ability to just add a new manufacturer from right there. So I'm going to go into my manufacturer's configuration folder. It's currently empty. And up in the top bar, in the action bar, I'm going to select user actions. Let's say create user action. I'm going to call this create manufacturer. And once I do that, it drops me into the flow designer. So once I'm in here, I can create any kind of flow I want to perform the action that I need it to perform. So for our purposes, it's going to be pretty simple. The only thing I'm going to add here is a run subflow, if I can. Subflow. May not be an option in here, and if it's not, that's okay. This is a little bit different, but we'll see if it works. Cool. So because this is a configuration folder, this is a little bit different than what we've seen before. So this subflow step is not the run subflow step. By default, it's defaulting to an action. It wants a pre-built configuration folder action. I don't want to use a pre-built configuration folder action. I'm going to use a flow that I've already created before, which is my create manufacturers flow. System designers. Maybe I can't. Looks like it's not going to let me. That's fine. That's not a big deal. We don't actually need to use the subflow for this. It won't take about a minute to actually finish this out. What I am going to do is I'm going to add my show form step. And on my form, I'm going to pick or create my manufacturer's form. And then with the information that I collect from this form, I want it to create the entity manufacturers. So I'm going to go down to my user defined types because manufacturer is a composite type and I'm a user and I created it. So user defined types. Yeah, you're probably right, Dari. So Dari says the flow you need to pick needs to live in the config folder. And you're probably absolutely right about that. Here we go. I'm going to find my database structures and my manufacturers. Pretty sure this is the right one. And I'm going to choose my create action because I'm trying to add a new one. So I'm going to say create. And just like we did before when we created this flow, I'm using kind of the default built-ins for both of these things. So this is the automatically generated form. So it knows that it's creating the data type manufacturer, so it doesn't break out the elements. So I'm going to need to expose those properties. So I'm going to, well, for the input, I'm going to ignore. The output is going to be manufacturers. And then here, this is where I'm going to expose those properties. I'm going to say build data and map in the elements. Is it called input? Is that really the way I left that? Oh, yep. Rename my data type so that I don't confuse myself. And then map in those properties. So of manufacturer, I want address and name. And I'm going to leave all the rest of those fields blank. So the entity framework is going to create the ID for me, and I'm not using custom long and short description for this entity. So that's all I need to do. This is going to be my action to create a new manufacturer. So I save that. I can close. And now when I go to my dashboard, fingers crossed if this has worked, when I right click, I now have this create manufacturer action. Whereas when I click on my software name, I don't have any actions. But it's only when I click on manufacturer, because I created this action inside the configuration folder for this data structure specifically. So once I select that, it shows me my manufacturer form. Let's see, who's someone that we haven't used yet? So let's say Salesforce, and add that, and then it appears in my list. So we should be. Yeah, we're recording. So once I create my new manufacturer, it added it to the list. I did have to refresh, but we can see it updated. I was able to create a new, oh, this is different. I need to turn that off. Manufacturer in my list of manufacturers. Gosh, that's annoying. So this turned itself off, which is interesting. Here we go. Yeah, so that might be a bug that we just discovered. So I'm going to keep an eye on that. So that's configuration folder actions. So we just did one to create. Is there anything more interesting that we can do with that? Go. Here we go. So yeah, we can do an update. So it's basically the same. There's not a whole lot different. It's going to be pretty much the same flow. These are really pretty simple. They're incredibly useful, but most of the time when you're using this, there's not a whole lot going on in those. So I tell you what, let's do an update. We're going to go and we're going to create a configuration folder for our software. Enable actions down here at the bottom so that it creates my software configuration folder, which is currently empty. Here we go. I'm going to create a user action, and we're going to call this update software. So previously, I used the create step out of my automatically generated steps for my data structure. So for update, which steps do you think I'll use? Take a look in your steps toolbox and see what you have in there for an update step. There may be a couple of options. Selective update, yep. I was thinking there was also a save step, but I guess not for database structures. So we do have the selective update. So this is what we're going to use to modify those fields. So here I have my software form. I'm going to go ahead and pick existing, choose the software form, and connect that. I'm going to ignore my input. I think there might be an action there, actually. Okay, cool. Built into the form, good. And then so on the selective update step, so the one thing that we do need to do over here is there is this ID on the input. So whenever we're doing selective update, we have to tell it what entity it's updating. So it's going to take values from our form, whatever we select, but then we need to tell it which entity it should be modifying. So for the ID, I'm going to say select from flow. And then I have this entity property. So this is the entity that was right-clicked on whenever this action shows. So in order to view this action, we have to have selected an entity and right-clicked on it in order to get our configuration folder actions. And so that's the entity that it's referring to here. These are going to be all of the properties for that entity already. So I'm going to say ID. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't want to ignore these. I want to show all of that information at the jump. And then for our outputs, yep, we've got input, good, good. Select from flow, entity, manufacturer. Oh, no, that's gonna get weird. Okay, so this will be challenging. This will be fun. Let me ignore that for right now. Here we go. So let's debug this. Let's see how this goes. How's this going to work? Let me actually just save that. I'm going to go back to my dashboard. If I right click on Office here, I get my update software action that we just created. And so in here, my manufacturer ID is blank. So the way that I've created this is the form actually contains this flow that goes out and says, okay, for all of the manufacturers that we have, show me their names and put them into a list. Now, I want to just show the manufacturer ID or the name of the manufacturer that we already have. But because that's happening within the flow and it's meant to be, this is a create form. So we're supposed to be like going in and selecting which one this should be. I'm going to need to build some logic before my form shows so that it will automatically populate that field. So let's go back into our software configuration. I've got my 2 steps that already exist. So I'm going to go ahead and move those down a little bit because we're going to do some stuff beforehand. So looking at my data type, so I have my entity, which is my software, and it contains manufacturer ID. So I only have the ID. I don't have the name that I actually want to populate in the form field. So for that, I'm going to add a step. And this should be, let's go to all steps. We could use something like a fetch entities, but we're using the user-defined types, and I think that that is a good best practice. So I'm going to go down and find software and get software by ID. Oh no, it's get manufacturer by ID. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. Apologies, everybody. Get manufacturer by ID. That's what I'm actually trying to see. So in here, the ID that I want is going to be within my entity, and I have my manufacturer ID as part of this structure. So now, this is going to be output as manufacturer. And then in my form, instead of ignoring the manufacturer input, I'm going to select from flow, find my manufacturer, and display its name. What are you mad about? Go get manufacturer by ID, declare, but it has different type. Oh, right. Okay. Because I'm already using that somewhere else. So now, before my form even shows, my flow is going to get manufacturer by ID. It's going to use the entity ID. So the entity, that's the line item that I've actually right-clicked on. Say, okay, well, what's the manufacturer ID in this data structure or in this data member, in this object? Look that up, provide the name, it's going to display it in that dropdown, and then my user will have the ability to change that as well based on the active form flow that I have inside this form. And then they'll be able to update any of that information. We'll be able to change whatever we want about that. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Go back to my dashboard, and now I can right click and update software. I have my form, it's automatically populating the drop down, and then we can change that. If I decide that I want Office to have been made by Salesforce, I make that change. Refresh, refresh. Did something wrong. Oh, right. I didn't actually modify any of the properties. So for the data, we need to select which fields we want to be updated in our selective update step. Very important. We have to tell the selective update step that it should be updating something in order for this to have any meaning. So manufacturer ID, in order for that one to work, I need some extra steps after the form too. So for this one, I actually do need to fetch entities. And we're going to look up our manufacturer by name because that's the way our form works. So results, we can delete, skip it. The type that we're going to look up is our manufacturers, and we're going to filter. Our fetch criteria is going to be where name equals manufacturer. There we go. Manufacturer ID is going to be our entity results. ID first. Name will be name. Whatever our user has input in the form, which is, that's the variable name that we're using. This is why it's important to make sure that you are renaming your variables as you go. Otherwise, you end up with confusing things like input. What does that mean? Purpose and size. There we go. So now it's getting a little bit more complex. And go back to my software dashboard, update software. And now I want to say that Salesforce is responsible for Microsoft Office. Hit OK, refresh, it's disappeared. Come back in here, Salesforce now owns Office. I can decide that I want this to be, I'm going to send it back to Microsoft. I'm going to put it back in the right manufacturer. And then I decide that I want to call this Microsoft Office. So I'm going to update the name. So Microsoft Office, Office Suite, I'm going to call this Word, Excel, PowerPoint. And I'm going to say that's actually 5 gigabytes. Okay, make those changes. Now the name has been updated. If I click update software, I have these new data definitions that appear within there. So the update got a little bit complex. It became more complex because of the way my forms are set up, because of the process, the greater process that I have surrounding this. But you get an idea of how these CRUD actions work. You just create yourself a flow. You get some right-click actions on your entities so that you can select and make changes to those items, those create, read, update, delete actions. How does that sound, everybody? What questions do we have about that? Cool. I see no questions. Good deal. We're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, which is nice. So I think that what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take an early lunch. When we come back, I'm going to tell you about PDF files. We're going to go over some advanced list management and file handling. We'll probably actually end up finishing up early today, which is good news. So apologies for rushing everybody earlier. I was afraid that we were going to end up running out of time. So no rush. We can pause as often as anybody needs to. But I think we're going to go ahead and break for lunch. We'll come back in 1 hour. So by my time, that'll be at 12:15 Eastern US time. I'm going to put a timer up on the screen. Oh, there's a cat one. I'm so tempted. I'm going to do the jellyfish. So 1 hour, everybody. We'll see you back here at 12:15 my time. Enjoy it, and I'll see you in just a bit. There we go. So we're going to take the data out of our I9 import, and we're going to be placing those values into our PDF form in decisions. So somewhere in here, we actually have a link to the PDF document or to the I9 document. So here it is. It's a PDF. I'm going to share this in the chat just in case there are any Google Drive weirdness. There we go. So here's our I9. So if you've ever worked in the United States, this should be pretty familiar. If you're going to work for a US company, this is something that you have to fill out. You are determining your eligibility to work in the United States. So there are several ways that you can do this. You could be a citizen of the US, you can be someone here on a work visa, and this document attempts to, or is supposed to, account for what your eligibility type is. So we have these 4 categories, and then there's some documentation that gets attached to these to say, yes, we verified this information. Someone else has to sign it and say, yes, I verified this info. I've seen that this person presented these documents to me. And so this is the process that we're building. We fill out this form, make it all super easy, automated, so that our user, either the employee being hired or someone who is assisting them, that's this preparer section down here, someone who's assisting them to fill out this form can certify that it was filled out correctly. So with this PDF, yeah, it doesn't look like this is form fillable, or at least it's not in this version. Let me open it up this way. Aha, there it is. So if I take it out of the Google Drive version and just open it up as a file, each of these fields are actually fillable. So I don't have to draw on this form. This PDF knows that it has these fields and it's expecting values in them. So we're going to tell decisions to place our values into these editable fields that already exist. So we're not going to have to map it and say, okay, well, this should go in this area, and I think it should be 3 pixels down and 4 pixels over, anything crazy like that. It's going to already have these fields, and we're going to tell decisions to put our data into them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my project folder, and I'm going to go to my flows folder. And this isn't something that necessarily needs to be done in a subflow, but just for the purpose of the fact that we're doing it in a demonstration, I am going to put this element into a subflow. So I'm going to create a flow. This is going to be my PDF generation flow. I'm going to click create, and it's going to drop me into the flow designer. So in here, I know I need a step to manipulate the PDF file. So I'm going to search PDF and see what we come up with. Convert image, merge documents, make PDF document read only. So here's one that looks interesting. So we have set PDF form fields. I'm pretty sure this is the one I want. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that onto my canvas, connect my start step to it. Go. And so in here, Yeah, so I have my properties for this set PDF form fields. It wants the file, so it wants to know, hey, what's the file that we're actually uploading? So this is the PDF file example. Here we go. It's been a minute since I've done this, so I'm kind of remembering as we go. Everybody bear with me. We're all going to learn together. So here, I believe I'm going to choose my I9 file. And once I do that, I should get my list of PDF fields that already exist in that document. I'm going to choose a file, grab that I9, and upload that. Here we go. Click away, back in. Oh, check that out. Wow. Cool. So it actually already did this better than I thought. So it's already given us our PDF field definitions. So these are already here. So we have citizen of the United States, alien registration number, et cetera, all of the fields that are editable on our form. And we do also have in the requirements document, oh, I stopped sharing. So in the requirements document, there's also a helpful guide. So Excel to PDF mapping table of which Excel fields should match up to which fields in the PDF. So this is going to make this nice and easy for us. I'm going to share this in the chat. And again, this will be in the LMS. Oh, I shouldn't download that as a PDF. Sorry, everybody. Let me fix that file. Download as Excel. I'm going to put both files in the chat just in case some people may actually want a PDF now that I'm thinking about it. So there's the PDF version and the Excel version for whichever you would rather have. So here, this document is going to tell me which fields should count and what data I should be mapping into them. So using this, I'm just going to drag this over to my other window so that I can look at it while we go. We go back over to decisions. And then here in my PDF fields definitions, I do need to add some input data to this flow. I need that I9 import data to be able to pass this in. So I'm going to add a input data here. I'm going to call it import row. And this is going to be of the type I9 import data. Go. So now I have my import row, it's going to be passed in, and now these are going to be properties that are available to my PDF mapping step. So here in the PDF field definitions, if I hover over each one of these, I get a little pencil. And I believe text can be no, select editor. Never mind. Apologies. So once I clicked off and clicked back in, I actually got the input section. So that's where we're going to map these. Sorry, y'all. It has been a minute. So for each of these fields, I'm going to map in the appropriate value from my data structure. Now, some of these are going to be like processed logically. If I'm remembering right, there's going to be some fields that we can't account for yet because we haven't built out the rest of the process. So I may ignore some inputs that you won't be ignoring when you're actually doing this live. I'm going to set this up as close to the way you're actually going to use this as possible, knowing that we're doing things out of order and without having built the rest of the process around this. So citizen of the United States. So this one, we're going to find it in the list. It should be in here. Citizenships. This is actually undefined 3. Maybe we've made some changes here. What have we got? Okay, so I believe that that's one of those things that we're going to finish mapping out later. So I tell you what, I'm going to go ahead and ignore undefined 3 and the citizenship. Clear. We're going to map in the things that we can account for right now and ignore everything else, because some stuff we're going to have to figure out programmatically. So alien registration number. So that's our USCIS number. So if that exists, that's the value that we want to pass in. So I found that here in the document in the Excel to PDF mapping table. So it says USCIS number matches up to alien registration number. So that's what I need to pass in there. So I'm going to pick, I'm going to go to my import row and find that USCIS number, just like that. A non-citizen national. I believe that this is another one that we're going to ignore for now. Yeah. Ignore. So our form I-94 admission, we're going to grab that out of our import row, admission number. Ignore that. Foreign passport number, that's one of the elements that comes from our import row. So we're going to select foreign passport number. Alien authorized register. So I believe, oh yeah, no, this is also an ignore for right now. Here we go. We're going to ignore the preparer's or translator signature, because that's something that we're going to add later. We're going to have a form that we can see in our mockup where our user is going to be able to actually sign these documents. So that's what's going to be mapped in from here. But for right now, when we're just creating the base I-9 form before anybody signed it, we're going to ignore that. So address. I'm just going to map in the actual address value. So these are actually broken down. We're going to need to do some text manipulation to change these values so that they appear correctly on the form. But just for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to just pass in the address value. Registration number. Again. USCIS. So I may have mapped in the wrong one previously, but that's okay. I think we're getting the idea of how this step works, which is what's important. Just make this bigger, get zoom out of the way. Number 2, yeah, I'm gonna ignore that. Carbon number, this one comes from our data structure. Zoom. Grab that there. City or town, not flow data. Import row, city. Phone number in here? Is that one of the values? Yep, phone. There we go. First name. Pretty sure this is going to be our other name. That's other last name, so we'll ignore that. Ignore. Last name. Here we go. Here we have the other last name. So QR code section, you are going to use this as part of your project. One of the things that you're going to do is use the QR module to place a QR code on this document itself that will take the user to the folder where this document lives here in Decisions. Ignore all the signature fields. State. So for today's date, I'm going to go ahead and make that No, select from flow data, and use the start time. Oh, it wants a string. So month, day, year, edit. Formatting. For date, we're gonna go with that. Yeah, perfect, because it is a 4-digit year. Cool. Undefined. So these undefined fields, these are listed out in the Excel to PDF mapping document. I'm just going to ignore them for now because we just want to see how this actually works. What is it going to look like whenever it generates this? And zip. So now I've mapped in all of my fields. It's going to generate that document for us. I'm going to go ahead and add a simple form here. With the document viewer. So this is something that you're going to use a lot this week. And it's a pretty simple process to add a document viewer to a form. So I'm going to go ahead and pick or create form. I'm going to create a new one. We call this my document viewer form. And just like we did with the file input form, I'm just going to go ahead and set this to be a single column and a single row, both one resizable. So it's just the entire body of this form. And then in the components toolbox, I'm going to search document viewer and add that right here. And then a single button that just says close. So this is a form that you're going to need to build for this week. This is the view document form. Very simple, displays the I-9 and just has a single button that says close. So you're going to use this for those view actions in your CRUD actions in your configuration folder. I call this the I-9 and save. So my PDF fields, or my set PDF form field step, is going to output a PDF file called PDF file. So I'm going to map that into my I-9 form on my document viewer. There we go. Kind of a funky looking flow. Just going to clean that up. So I'm going to demonstrate what this actually looks like in practice. Does anybody need assistance? Do we have questions so far? Oh, excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to save my PDF generation flow. I'm going to go back to my import main process flow. And so my CSV to object mapping and my import data form, it's going to output a list of import data. So I'm not just getting one item. One of the things that you need to do for your process this week is that you're going to add a for loop right after this runs so that it will process each of those rows. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to my main process flow. I'm going to grab that for each step and connect it on my import tail. So the for each step, we should be familiar with this one, I think. I believe we've used this before, I hope. So this for each step is going to iterate through a list of entities, whatever I pass into it, and do some things for each of those items in the list. So it wants a collection, a list of objects that it can interact with, and a type. So the type is going to be import data. So I'm going to find my VW import data structure that we created previously. And the collection of that data that it's going to be working through is going to be the output of my import data form for the ones that are selected to be yes. So I'm actually going to add a quick rule here. To only grab the true values. Data. Somewhere in here. Cool. So this is the rule I'm looking for. It will be found in the designer entities rules. Interesting. Oh, so designer entities rules, and it's just one of the basic rules that we have available. So this is a pre-built rule. I don't have to write a statement for this. It's just going to be if value is true. And if it is true, I want it to go to my for each loop. And if it's not, do nothing. So I'm going to go ahead and call this import is true. And so any items that on my data repeater, I toggle the true to be yes, toggle that toggle switch to be yes, those values are going to go through to my for each step. So for each of those lines, I'm going to have it do my PDF generation. So after this point, this is where my flow will no longer look like yours in practice, because you're supposed to have the single item flow. You're going to need to do some text manipulation, change those social security numbers so that they match the correct format. You're going to break down that address to split out the like the house number from the street name. So there's a lot of manipulation that's going to go into this before we actually get to this point. Everything up through here, though, yours should look more or less like mine. Like these steps, this is basically what the flow ends up looking like. I'm using a rule to determine if my Boolean value is true because I made a slight modification. I will tell you, as your instructor, you're allowed to do that. That's a change that we will allow if you would prefer to use a Boolean and set yours up like mine, totally fine. If you're using a string, then you're going to need to use something like a rule collection filter step that we are familiar with from your previous project. So in the USPS project, we used that one to find our lists. I believe you used it last week pretty extensively too, if I'm remembering right. But that's what we would use there to determine if the string is yes. However, I don't like string matching. I feel like it's a little bit risky. And so this rule is going to take care of that for us as long as our input value is a Boolean. Here we go. And then once that's done, I just want my flow to end. So I'm going to go ahead and say that once the flow, once this loop has completed, it's just going to go straight to the end step. So here my PDF generation flow, I'm going to pick that PDF generation flow that we just created. And then I'm going to send my loop right back to the start. So I want it to generate that PDF document for each of our data rows and then quit. Not do anything else. So I do have constant true to finish mapping these things out apparently. So imported rows. Yes. Import row, it's going to be item. So whenever you're using a for each, unless you change that, which I would recommend. So by default, the output name is item and then item index. So I'm again remembering that with your list, it assigns each item in the list a number starting with 0. And so that would be the number of the item that it's iterating through. Is item index. So I'm going to leave this as is just for the purposes of example. Normally, I would want to rename this to be something more descriptive. But here for my import row, the item that it's going to be iterating through, the one row in the list that my for each step is currently processing, I'm going to say find that, and it is item. And that's all of my validation issues. So this should be happy. Let's run this and see what happens. I want to see what my PDF form looks like. Be aware that I am fully expecting this PDF form to look like a mess because I didn't really put the time and energy into making sure that it's formatted correctly. I haven't done any of my string formatting to fix any of that data. So I expect it to be messy, but I do expect some fields to have the correct values, and that's what we're trying to see. Drag my CSV file in and import it. It shows me my form. So I'm going to choose which ones I want it to import. And I'm just going to select like the first, 5 or 6, 7 here. I'm going to import those. Ooh, error getting document data. See login for server for more info. So something went wrong. So import row, it did that. Cool. So item, import data. Import row, yep. Oh. What's a string? Document. Oh, so important to note. So document and file data. So 3 different ways that decisions can handle a file. Right now, we're using file data. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in just a moment. I have some slides for this, but currently my PDF file is file data. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as file data so that this can actually process it. So we will have slides to tell us more about that in just a few minutes. But let's try to debug this again. Let's see if we can actually get this to work before we start talking about different types of documents and how decisions handles those. So I'm going to select these first ones, all the showing ones. Okay, here we go. So here's my PDF. I'm going to make this bigger so that we can actually see it. And this looks pretty good. So I need to fix my date time formatting. It's currently sending through the time, and we don't want that. We just want it to fit the format, month, day, year, year. I have the correct last name, first name, middle initial. This is all looking pretty good. 7 Milwaukee Circle. Okay, that's fine. New York City. I like it. Cool. So we do still have some work to do here. There's a lot of empty fields, a lot of things that should be checked that aren't, that we'll need to account for programmatically. We're going to need to build out more logic to handle things like, is this person a citizen? And if they are, how should it add that to the document? But we can see how we can map in the values. So does this make sense? Let's see, can you go back to the collection input for the for each step? Will that output be the output from the import form? So yes, that's right. Let's see, so here, Zoom being Zoom. Here we go. So my for each step, yeah, I'll show you in the property editor. So my for each step is taking in my imported rows, which is the output of my data repeater. So the data repeater is going to take in all of the objects that are CSV from our CSV. It's going to turn them into import data, our import data flow structure. Then I have this rule afterwards to say, hey, only show me the ones that my user has selected true. And then for each of those, it's going to take that imported row that gets passed into it along the true path, and it's going to generate the PDF for each one. Yep, and that's fine, Karen. So we're doing all the demonstrations, but yeah, you did miss the first hour, so you will have to go back and probably recreate some things. The flow that I just created, however, you could make that, and you are going to use that as part of your project. But yes, you will need to go back and rewatch the earliest part of today's session. Yeah, so why do we only see one PDF if there are many records present? So that's because of the way I've built this flow, and I was using the debugger. So if I go back, debug, do this again, drag in my file. I'm gonna say send 3 of them through. So currently this is an in-session form, so it's showing it to me, but within my PDF generation flow, it's showing me the form. I click close, the loop starts again, it shows me the next one. The loop starts again. When I hit close, it's going to show me the next one. So right now, because this is an in-session form, it's trying to display these forms to me each time. And even though this button does nothing but just close the form, because it's an in-session form and this is an actionable button, it behaves like any actionable button on any form. It expects the user to take some input here until the next time, exactly, so that the loop can run again. Still going. So something went wrong there. How many of these are you taking in there, buddy? 5. It's doing 5. Weird. True is true. Oh, did I do that as a constant? I bet I did. Gosh, I sure did. That was silly. So select from flow. So the reason that was happening, it was just going to keep going, was because in my rule, I just set it to be constant true. So everything is going to evaluate true. That was pretty silly. So what I actually need to do is in my imported row, nope, in my item, no, yeah, so imported rows. It's the import value. I'll import. Oh, you know what? I think I need to rearrange these steps. Let me put that inside the loop. That'll make this easier. There we go. And so now I can say if items import value is true, then my rule will process correctly. Yeah, good call, Ala. So I needed to put that inside the loop so that I can evaluate those individually. And I'm sure there's another way to do it. That's just the for at least me and Ala, that was the solution that presented itself, and it works just fine. Good deal. So everybody, we've already checked off a lot of the items on this week's project. You're still going to get the full week. We're still going to present on Friday. However, hopefully we're knocking out some items. We're going to save everybody a little bit of heartache by going over these things in advance and doing them as part of our lessons. I hope that we like that. Can't promise that we'll continue that into next week, because next week is going to be a little bit more about figuring it out. Like this week, it's building the process. Next week is we're going to give you a process, and we expect you to kind of use all of the skills that you've learned over the course of the previous 4 weeks to fix it. So we may not do this again. However, I hope it's valuable for this week. Cool. So as promised, I am going to tell you a little bit about file handling and decisions. You're going to be working with several of these file types, if I'm remembering right. It's been a minute since I've built this project. But you're going to be working with several of these different ways that decisions interacts with files within this one project. So previous to now, we've been working with file data. That's the way we've been manipulating files that we've been working with in our previous decisions projects. So when we've been uploading CSVs, we've been working with file data. We should be pretty familiar with that one. But there are a couple of other ways that we can work with files in decisions. Here we go. So there are two ways to store files within decisions. So manually, I can take a file and just drop it into my decisions environment. I can take this I9, I can bring it in. It gives me the option to import. So if this was like an export of a decisions project, I could import it. However, if this is not an export of a decisions project, this is just a PDF. So I'm going to say add as document, and then it just appears as a document in the folder tree. Just like that, I can access it, view it, download it from right here. I think it'll let me view it, may not. But it's now stored in my decisions environment. It's right here in the folder. As you can see, when I click on it, it downloads. So it's now stored as a document in decisions. That's the manual process for this. The other ways that you are more familiar with are the automated ones. These are the ways that we work with files programmatically in decisions. So we can use the document service, which you're going to use a little bit this week, and you might have actually used prior to now. And then also file reference or file reference entity. Here we go. So the two ways that we store documents in decisions, we can have either file data or a document. So file data and document, they operate just a little bit differently. However, both of those behave in the way that you're accustomed to seeing. We get that variable that we can pass around our flows. This is stored in the decisions database. So it's in the dbo.document table, and it operates just like any other entity in decisions. Any other entity that we're working with, any composite type, it gets stored in the database, and it's part of the decisions data structure, for want of a better phrase that's not confusing with all of our other terminology. This is not the most efficient storage method because that's calling on the database to go and say, okay, well, let's find this file, let's reconstruct it from its file data, all of those composite properties that we have that make up the file. So within our file data, we have the contents, and it's broken down into bytes, file name, ID, length. It uses all of this to reconstruct that file from the database data. The other way that we can store files and decisions is as a file reference. So this is not stored in the decisions system. It's not in the decisions database, but it's in a folder within the decisions folder, within the decisions server folder on the C drive of the server that houses your decisions environment. And then it uses the path. So here, C program files, decisions, file storage / whatever your file is, or the folder that it's in, to store that file, and then we'll call it from there on the C drive or wherever your decisions is installed, whenever you need to call that file. So whenever you want to display it, instead of going back to file data, grabbing all of the info that it knows about that file from the database and then reassembling it, it uses the Windows file system to go and find the file itself and then display it that way. So this is called a file reference. So it's not a file data or a document that Decisions is controlling and manipulating itself. It's just a file that Decisions has access to in a Windows folder in your Decisions environment or on your Decisions server. So these are the two vocabulary words that you're going to want to take away from today. So we have file data or document stored in the database, and file reference, which is a file path stored in your Windows environment. So back in my flow, if I didn't want to use that file data, is it here? We were messing with that. I don't think it was. Nope. Oh, it was in the document viewer. Right. Okay. So here in the document viewer, we have this set currently to file data so that it can read that file data that I'm passing in because I haven't done anything else with it. We can also set that to document, which is using the Decisions document service. So I'm going to drag, oh, go away, Zoom. I don't want you. Nope. Nope. Just open up a junk flow. So in the steps toolbox we can find a bunch of steps that we can use to interact with different types of documents, including ones that are stored in the document service and file data. So if I go down to, and these, a lot of these aren't searchable. So that's the reason that I want to go into the steps toolbox and show you this, is that we know that there's somewhere around 2,500 steps in the steps toolbox by default, and then more and more get added every time you create elements that generate more steps that are meant for that thing. And then most of the ones that are searchable are like the most commonly used steps. So if I want to go to the search box and type in document, I'll get some results, but it's not going to be the complete list. So I get things that convert document, but these are not all the steps that are available for working with documents. So down here in my steps toolbox, I'm going to find the integration and internal services. And within here, we have the document service. So here I'm going to find all of the additional steps that I can use to interact with documents that are being stored by decisions using the document service. So some of these you're going to end up using this week. So remember that, write down that path, because again, these aren't searchable. It's under integration, internal services, document service. Here we go. And as promised, everybody, I told you it was probably going to be a short day. Apologies. This morning, I really thought that we were going to have a lot more to go over. However, so my own personal opinion about this week's project is that it's a little bit easier than a lot of the ones you've been doing. It's considered to be more complicated because you're doing more of that PDF manipulation that's harder to do if you don't have like the context to build on it. But overall, I think that this week's project is a little bit easier. The hardest parts are probably going to be manipulating the text to split the strings and get everything formatted in the correct way. But the actual like meat of it, like creating the PDF, putting the fields in the right places, adding the signature, that stuff's all pretty straightforward. I do want to show you that real quick. I do want to show you the signature box because I know I've talked a lot about the DocuSign module, but I do want to make a point that isn't necessary. So I do want to show you very quickly in a form without going too heavy, without needing to install that DocuSign module. We have the signature pad form component. So you can add that to your form. No need to install any additional modules. This is a form component that exists in the default installation that you can use for this project. However, that actually covers all of our content. That's everything that we've got for this project. So we do still have like the whole rest of the day. So are there anything that we can identify that you need assistance with or that you want to know more about before? So QR, yeah, so that one, I believe you will need to install the module if it's not already installed on your system. So that one's actually pretty straightforward. But let's see what we're going to be doing with a QR. Yeah, so we do have the documentation in here. So this one I'm going to wait on. So this isn't something that we typically give lesson on. We have the documentation included here. But what I will do is once we've had a couple of days to kind of work on it, because part of our philosophy here at Decisions, and our Decisions employees know this, and you probably heard me mention the 10-minute rule, we want you to try and figure some things out on your own. There are elements that are more complicated that we wanted to introduce you to here via instruction. But with the QR one, I kind of want to let you see what you come up with. Now, if you have a specific question about QRs, I'll be glad to answer it or do my best to answer it without spoiling the project. But I'm not going to do a lesson on QRs at this time. What we will do, and I'll tell Jared if it's not me that's with y'all on Wednesday, is that we'll do a demonstration then. So tree view combined with document viewer. I may need a little bit more context here, Alla. I'm going to allow you to speak And if you'd like to tell me more about tell me about your question. Okay, so if you can type out, let me know what you mean there. Tree view combined with document viewer. And keep those questions coming. The worst I can say is I'm not going to go over it. that I want you to try and figure it out on your own first. But go ahead if there's things that you can identify. But like I said, most of the work in this one is going to be just making sure that the information gets processed properly and gets put into the correct formats before it gets added to that document. So form that has a tree view to show us what files are available. And when we click on the document, the viewer will show us the selected file. So yeah, I mean, that's something that there's not a built-in component for that. That's something that you would have to build. And so, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine a way to do that. That's not going to be part of this project. I just want to make sure. So the task spreadsheet, yeah, John, I shared that earlier in the chat, but I'm going to make sure that it's in the LMS as well. But it is this one. So the PDF generation task list. So if it's not already in Basecamp, it will be as soon as this call is over. Data. Here we go. There's that file. So yep, so there's both of those files again, and once again, they will be in the LMS as soon as this call is over. So both of those files are now in the Zoom chat, and they will be in the LMS as soon as this call is over. Now, as far as your question, Ala, that's a really good idea. And so you would need to build that out programmatically. And I'm not going to do it right now just because honestly, I just don't want to put the effort in. But that may be a demonstration that we do at a later time. So the way you would need to do that is you would need to add a component. I'm imagining kind of a left and right. You would have, on the left, either a drop-down list or maybe a data repeater to show you, hey, here are the files that I have in a particular folder that you as the developer have decided. You can also do this as a page. But then once you select one of those, use an active form flow to then display in the document viewer the appropriate document. But that's something that you would have to build out. There's not built-in components to do that as far as I know. Great questions. What other questions do we have? Are we ready to get started developing? Cool. I don't see any. So as always, please do reach out in Slack. We'll always be happy to answer your questions. Give us as much context as you can so that we can help you. We don't want anybody struggling. So remember that 10-minute rule. We want you to spend at least 10 minutes trying to figure out something for yourself. But then as soon as that 10 minutes passes, post in my channel so that Jared or I can jump in there and give you a hand. But with that, everybody, I think that's it. I think that's all we have for today. So I'll hang out on the call for just a few more minutes, make sure that there are no other questions. But then happy building, everybody. So Kieran asks, where can I find the recording for this session? So this will be in the exact same place where you click to join the session. So, and for everybody, we have a new guest with us. We have Kieran. So Kieran has been doing training asynchronously with Jared, but they're not caught up. And so we're going to have them in our class with us. But yeah, in the exact same place where you click to join this call, that's where the recording will be. I don't have any control over how long it takes for that recording to become available. So they tend to be long calls. We've been going for like 5 hours now. So once Zoom has finished processing that file, it will then process it again in our Basecamp system and then make the file available to you there to view. Cool. All right, everybody. Like I said, I'm going to hang out on the call for just a few more minutes. But if you don't have any questions, enjoy the rest of your day and happy building. We'll see you tomorrow.